Class to our next lesson in our unit on the Age of Imperialism between 1848 and 1914. I just want to recap a little bit on what we've been doing in the previous weeks before running up this lesson. Last week we looked at the 1957 Indian Mutiny, also known as the Sepoy Rebellion, as we discovered, and a few other names as well. And of course, we looked at how the concept of empathy could be used to see both the colonised and coloniser sort of experiences in that. And we've of course looked more at the broad sort of, creation of markets, perpetuation of discrimination, for instance, we've seen how sort of these various, imperial powers have raced to gobble up Africa. And so today we're going to be doing something a little bit different, but using these previous lessons as a bit of a bridge to jump onto our current point, which is looking at these second-order historical concepts of ideology and belief and change and continuity. We've done a little bit of the second one, but can anyone tell me what ideology refers to?
It's like what people think about stuff, isn't it? Like their beliefs.
Yeah, no, it's a very good definition. Yeah. We'll unpack that a little bit more, but essentially, your definition is correct. It's basically the set of beliefs, in this case political beliefs, that are specific to a group or culture. And today we're going to be using the British Empire as our main example, although this certainly applies to all these various empires. But essentially, when we talk about the ideologies and beliefs, we're talking about the reasons that people in this empire, sort of from the very top to the very bottom, soldiers, citizens, and so forth, gave for this empire existing. What were the justifications they gave? If you were to ask a Briton on the street, during the 19th century, why is the British Empire good? What reasons would they give? And of course, we'll be looking at how these ideas changed, but also how they, in many ways, stayed the same, because they were always used to prop up this institution. And I'm going to be exploring three basic ideas, or we will. That of nationalism, white man's burden, and scientific racism. Can anyone tell me what nationalism refers to? It's okay if you don't know. Yeah.
Yes? It's like when people really love their country and think that others aren't as good.
No, that's a very good definition. It refers to sort of an extreme version of being patriotic. Patriotic is when you love country. To be nationalistic is when you think your country is the best, it's superior, and in many ways deserves to rule over others. And of course, we've seen that with every one of the empires. And so, basically, it's the idea that, for instance, Britons, as we've seen, think of themselves as cultured and democratic, and they see the Russians as, naturally led by a strong leader and rather husky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand out this sheet, you guys. It's an artefact we'll be looking at. And essentially, it gives three major examples here for each of these: nationalism, white man's burden, and scientific racism, which we're going through. Here you go, just these ones to hand out, thanks. And I'll just pin this one up here for the class to see. And so to do with that first example I've talked about, we've got a song from the Crimean War, which we haven't quite studied and we might not get time for, but it's essentially a war between sort of France and its allies, and of which England took a large part, against Russia, which was trying to attack the Ottoman Empire. And the reasons for that are varied, and we won't quite go into it, but we get this example in the chorus here. We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do. We've got the ships, we've got the men, and got the money too. We fought the bear before. That refers to Russia, though. And while we're Britain's true, the Russians shall not have Constantinople. So this idea that the Britons are naturally superior, that they can beat them, we see in the final lines, which I won't read out, that it refers to Old England and George the King and so forth. So we get this idea of the nationalism of Britain. And then we've got this second idea here of white man's burden. Has anyone heard of the white man's burden? No? No, not a problem. It comes from a poem in 1899 by a man named Rudyard Kipling. And the basic idea of it is that the powers of Europe were naturally superior to the cultures of, not races, but cultures of other civilizations, such as those in Asia and Africa and so forth. And it was their job, the European job, to bring them to civilization, which now, of course, we know to be a fairly bad idea. But so you see in the second image which I've handed out, we get this fairly racist, very horrible cartoon. of Britain, like this figure representing America, this figure representing Britain, sort of, carrying these other cultures up to this civilization. The idea that they were colonizing so that they could lift them up. And it's worth taking a look at how that's presented, which we'll get to in a sec. The last concept I'll be introducing today is the ideology of scientific racism. I'm sure, have you studied Darwin's theory of evolution in science yet? Yes? Yeah, okay, good. So I won't give the big introduction to that one yet then. But essentially the idea that comes out of it is we get this very wrong idea that one race of mankind, or humankind, should we say, is superior to another, naturally superior. That the strong survive and the lesser die off. Which we now know to be absolutely, totally scientifically wrong and absolutely immoral, but was very much in vogue at the time. So after Darwin, we get this idea going. And if you look at this last artefact here, you'll see that rather displayed quite horribly. We've got the Irish, which were seen as lesser at the time, portrayed as much more African in look, and of course we've got sort of the Negro there shown as inferior compared to, of course, the Anglo-Teutonic, which we'll get into a little bit later. But essentially this idea of being able to classify the different races. Yes?
Like the guy in the middle kind of looks like a statue.
Yeah, that's a very good example because we see them sort of almost this classical image, almost sort of a Greek-Roman sort of aspect. And I want you to hold on to this sheet because it's very important. The reason why we're doing this, sort of the learning objective of this, is to understand not just that these empires existed, what they did, but also the reasons they gave for being. What arguments did they use to justify some of the horrible things they committed? How was their misery continued? Why weren't there enough people who stood up and said, we shouldn't be doing this? And this is important in our own lives too, because not only does it show that in many ways, a lot of the reasons given at the time are still given for many actions today, but it allows us to think critically about these perspectives and really develop our own ideas on the issue. So that's very important. And that really leads on to our first activity. So I'll just get you to group into your tables and we'll look at the language and the images that are given for these. Okay? And I want you to basically work out, essentially what argument and how is being made in these various artifacts I've given. Thanks.